This is such a special day for so many reasons. Most importantly, this is a special day for us to celebrate Dorthea Rockburne. We first began working with Dorthea a few years ago to realize installations that she first created nearly 50 years ago. In this time, we have learned a great deal about her process, the art of the 20th century, and the ways in which art history can be and should be tuned to recount more of the things that happened in service of a fuller and richer history. We are grateful to Dorthea for guiding us in this journey. In addition to the acquisitions that we have made this year, which are numerous and incredible, we are grateful especially to Dorthea's gift of Locus, a group of works on paper from 1972. Thank you very, very much. I will say here that Dorthea did not take this journey alone. Heidi Giannotti, our wonderful director of exhibition design and installation, is chiefly responsible for all that you will see here presented of Dorthea's works. She and her team, Peter, Alex, Nicholas, Brian, Colin, and Aaron, have worked tirelessly since the fall of 2017 to realize this exhibition. I offer you my sincere thanks for all of your effort and ingenuity. I would also like to thank Elizabeth Peck, our senior registrar, who has provided significant guidance and support in getting the work from Soho to Beacon. Sydney Williams. Dorthea's wonderful studio manager has practically joined Dia as a conduit to make all things between Soho and the Hudson River Valley run smoothly. Thank you for the river. We will miss working with you, Sydney. And finally, I would like to thank all of the Dia staff here in Beacon who have pitched in numerous times to make sure that we could realize this exhibition in the best way possible. It is a wonderful achievement for everyone that keeps this building afloat. I want to turn now to our speaker for today, Robert Storr. Storr is a noted artist, critic, curator, and educator. He received a BA from Swarthmore College in 1972 and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1978. As a curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art from 1990 to 2002, he organized important thematic exhibitions as well as overwhelmingly important monographic shows on Elizabeth Murray, Gerhard Richter, Tony Smith, and Robert Ryman that brought new and deserved attention to each of these artists. After his tenure at MoMA, he turned to full-time teaching, becoming the first Rosalie Solow Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. There, he turned out great students, of which I count myself among them. Later, he was named the Dean of the Yale School of Art in 2006, a position that he held until recently when he returned to the classroom to teach painting, his first avocation. Throughout, he has lectured domestically and internationally and written widely. He's been a contributing editor at Art in America since 1981 and has written frequently for Art Forum, Frieze, and other publications. Storr's many honors acknowledge his wide-ranging skill set, to select a very small few. He received a Penny McCall Foundation grant for painting and honorary doctorates from the Maine College of Art and his alma mater, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2000, the French Ministry of Culture presented him with the Medal of the Chevalier des Arts, an award that simultaneously acknowledges both his deep engagement with culture as well as with politics, the two things that have fused all aspects of his personal and professional life. From 2005 to 2007, he was the visual arts director of the Venice Biennale, making him the first and last American invited to assume that position. His great success in the world of art, however, holds one, maybe others, but definitely one for today, unexplored fact. He once worked as a draftsman for Dorthea Rockburne sometime after his arrival in New York. This role fostered a long friendship between the two and spawned his deep knowledge of her work and her long career. I look forward to hearing his insights about Dorthea today. Please join me in welcoming Rob Storr.
I hope Courtney won't consider it ungracious of me, but I want to make two corrections. I'm not the last American curator of the Venice Biennale. Ralph Rugoff is going to do this. He might finish us off altogether as a country, but we'll see. I tried, but I didn't succeed. Now, the other thing is that, what is the other thing? I remember something very specific. What? Yes, I was. Yes? Oh, yes, I was. I'm going to talk about it, too. But anyway, there was one, so it'll come to me, but it doesn't matter. This talk is going to be a talk, not a lecture, but I do have notes to keep myself from wandering too far afield. And I also have strict instructions that we're not to let it run past 3 o'clock. So what I think I'm going to do is talk a combination of, laid out and extemporaneously for about 45 minutes, and then open it up to the House to have comments, questions, whatever. I am not in my role as an art historian at the moment, so I will not remember names, dates, and serial numbers. Conceptually, however, and experientially, I'm wide open to anything, including direct challenges, even from the artist. As I said, this is not a gallery talk, partly because the gallery we're in is devoted to GR and not DR. It wouldn't make sense to talk about what's in the gallery because what we're talking about is what DR did, which is over there. Now, I've been lucky to know both artists very well and to have worked with both, but for Dorthea, I worked for Dorthea. I was an installation draftsman. I first of all, I rehearsed the neighborhood in her studio downtown, and then I performed it at MoMA. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about that, which was fun. I worked very hard, and we worked hard together so I could really learn the moves, and it was a strenuous exercise. It's not easy. And the show was organized by Bernice Rose, who was my colleague in those days. Not my colleague, she was my friend in those days, but not my colleague, and later my colleague when I went to be a curator at MoMA. And as things happen, when you're young, when you're nervous, when you're a little bit over your head, you make mistakes. So I was in the galleries at MoMA, in the old basement galleries, and next to me was the team that was doing a drawing of Solowitz. And there was a group of them, and they were industrious, and they were also extremely experienced. I was doing Dorothea's drawing by myself, which was fine because it's not a drawing that required a full team. But in any case, I miscalculated by a couple of inches where we started. So I had to completely start the drawing over once I realized this. And this happened 3 nights, I think it was, before the show opened. So just to tell you what doing an installation like the one that's been done here and been done so well is like, it's got to be pitch perfect. And pitch perfect, I mean that visually, not auditorially, but Dorthea, I think, probably almost thinks of it auditorially as well. In any case, there will be no slide projections here of her work. It was offered to me, and I see no reason whatsoever to talk about slides when you're in a room with real works, and to talk about real works when you're over a matter of steps away from them. So I trust that everybody here is visually acute enough and determined enough to actually look at real things. It's an irony, of course, that one should talk about photography in this room because Richter is widely credited as being one of the premier photorealists of his time. But everything that he does is defeated when you photograph it, and the same is true for Dorthea. Dorothea's work contains subtleties that cannot be photographed. And the larger part of it, which cannot be photographed, is the spatial relationship of the viewer to whatever they're looking at. And in the case of her work, they're looking at many things all at once and sometimes in several positions from a single vantage point. Therefore, to talk about photographing this kind of work is to talk about a non sequitur. You can't. And there's no way that one could or should, or therefore we are in this odd position of talking about one unphotographable artist in the presence of another unphotographable artist. Now, it was mentioned by Courtney that I worked for Dorthea, and I did. Other people worked for her as well. One of them is here, Mel Kendrick. I don't know if Tip Dunham came down here, but Carol Dunham was another. Dorthea kind of viewed her relationships to her studio assistants as apprenticeships. And to a degree, they really were. Not a Renaissance apprenticeship in the manner of the old masters, but nonetheless one where you learned as much as you did. Or I should say, if you did hard, if you worked hard, you learned a great deal, partly by her design, partly simply by the nature of the problems she posed for herself visually and posed for us technically. And it changed my way of seeing. I hate giving these talks, I must tell you, and I'm doing this to pay a debt to Dorthea and also to honor Courtney, who asked me, because Courtney, she really wasn't my student. She was all set to go when she arrived, and I simply, said my blessing or whatever it was. She's a fantastic curator and a good art historian. I mean, a fantastic art historian. Both, I don't want to create unequal levels. And so I'm here because Courtney asked and because it was about Dorthea. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here and you'd be free of me. In any case. I do have this written down, some of it. Now, Dorthea's drawings are all about space folding and unfolding and refolding and expanding and contracting and so on. The dynamics of her work is about space, and you can sort of give that a hocus pocus aura if you wish, or you can just take it away and just talk about space as something that we experience, that we know from our senses, all of them, visual, our ability to walk around, our ability to touch, and so on. To be in space, to be in this space with this light, these clear stories, these paintings, and so on and so forth, is a unique experience. It cannot be replicated. And the importance of a lot of visual art now is precisely to remind us that there are experiences that cannot be replicated. And Gerhardt's work is about work that can be replicated, but that loses every time you do so, and that's part of his point. But most things that matter cannot be replicated, period. And Dorthea's work is in that category. And so we're sitting in a room, and we're thinking about things, and when I say the word space, I want you to think about yourself sitting in a room, not some kind of hocus-pocus metaphysical thing. I am not a metaphysician at all, and I do not think in those terms. Those who do, they have my perfectly okay for me, and I will listen to them, but I am interested in the here and now, in the tangible, phenomenal world. And I think Dorthea's work belongs to that world, even if it may be in some ways addressed to the other one. And I'm going to approach it from that angle, which is my angle, and people who wish to approach it from other angles, again, can do so because they're qualified, I'm not. Now, insofar as it is about all of that, it is about territory. Marking territory, and marking one's place in the world as a part of marking territory more generally, human marking of human spaces. Now, I will make one sidebar comment, which is that artists are phenomenally territorial. Artists are very keen to say what is theirs and what is not theirs, what is somebody else's and what is not somebody else's. And there's always this sort of pressure to say, what is the accomplishment of this artist in terms of a territory? In terms of also of the chronology of events. Who got there first? Well, I have never been interested in firstness. It just does not interest me. In fact, it bores me. And I think there's altogether too much conversation about who was first or second or third at doing something. I'm much more interested in what they did with it. I remember years ago talking to Felix Gonzalez Torres, and somebody had made he had made a stack, and then somebody else had pointed out that I think it was Giulio Paolini had done it earlier, and I also think Bruce Nauman did it earlier. And he said, well, it doesn't matter to me who did it first, it mattered who did it best. But in the arts, since there's no best either, there's no a priori standard of quality, complete, fresh, new experience in any form, whether it is familiar or unfamiliar, partially known or little known, is what matters. I think once Richard Serra said, an artist is only as good as the obscurity of their sources. And I think that is a true thing, right? Now, I think obscure sources can sometimes mystify work, and I think other times obscure sources can free you from knowledge of those sources that would require you to think about the sources and not what's right in front of you. That said, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I understand to be the context of Dorothea's work, because it does matter. But the whole business of who did it first is a routine out of Abbott and Costello. Who's on first? Who's on second? I can't even do it. Somebody here is a natural comedian, could do it. My ability for timing, even though what I do here is called stand-up art history, my ability to do timing is not so great. So let me just suffice it to say that I have read, I don't know how many articles by my colleagues, or at least people who share my job description, who are intent on proving that they found the origin of something. And if they did, again, my blessings to them, but I don't believe it for a minute, and I don't care. What I care about is what people do with opportunities that exist, whether they pick them up off the ground or conjure them out of thin air. That's what interests me, how the application of those ideas gives us, the viewing public, something we have never seen. And by giving us something we have never seen, reminds us that all experience is not repetition. A small margin of difference can be a whole world of difference. This we know from music. This we should know also in the visual arts. This we should know in all domains. So just because somebody can say, that must have come from so-and-so, is the first reason not to trust everything else they say thereafter. Now, what matters is the immediacy of experience, not where it comes from. How present it is, how vivid in its being in interaction with the viewer, and how it resonates beyond the immediate set of circumstances. Ooh, the monster in the building has just spoken. But there are some contextual things. For example, there was a man named Gene Hedge, and I thank Chris Lyon, who provided this movie, who did a series of works with industrial paper that were soaked in oil. And one could say, oh, all of Dorothea's soaked pieces come from that. I don't think it matters. I don't think it's true. I think it's simply that two people saw an opportunity and did it in utterly different ways. Okay? It is true that she went to Black Mountain College, and it is true that Albers was there from 33 to 49, but she was there later. So even though the groundwater was probably saturated with Albersian ideas, she was not doing Albers stuff. She was not following in line with the Albers ideology, if you will. Although she was a smart woman, she is now a smart, not so young woman, she would not have been unwise to follow it. And many people did, right? To choose your masters, if you want one, matters that what you choose a good one. And Albers was the best, really, frankly. I have nothing in common with his general view of the world, but his pedagogy and his way of thinking about many fundamentals of art are invaluable. And they're invaluable to me as a teacher, but they're also invaluable to me as a way of sorting through the underbrush of ideology, which now clouds our vision. So much of what we hear nowadays has nothing to do with what you can see. It has to do with abstract constructs that belong to other meta realms. Again, that is fine if you want to be in those realms. I don't. I can't get there, and I don't want to try and ruin my time in my realm by worrying about them. So the critical discourse around things is, as I say, something worth paying attention if that's your aptitude, but Albers grounds you in what you can actually see. Differences, nuances, cadences, colors, the whole thing. And we have lost that ability to a very considerable extent because we are so much creatures of secondary information. And just as a digression on Albers, for example, a very brilliant young woman who was at the Yale University Press did an online iPad version of the interaction of color. And she now is at Princeton. She got out of Yale, lots of people do. She did this thing, and it's extremely useful, and I recommend it to students. But it's important to remember that Albers did his color experiments with colored painted papers and not with digital means. And the reason being, in part, that it matters is that color which is projected into the world through filters is utterly different than color that is bounced back to the eye when the light hits something solid. So if you want to understand the theory of Albers, use the iPod. If you want to have the experience of Albers and all that he's trying to teach you, look at the colored papers, some of which, by the way, were painted by Richard Serra, if I'm not mistaken. The original silkscreen edition was done by Richard Serra. Now, that is to say that painting exists now because there are things that reproduction cannot do. And we are taught to think that painting can be reproduced in all kinds of ways. And of course, there are 1,000 schlock shops that reproduce paintings with fake brush marks in them. And there are 1,000 theoretical papers written about how there's no difference whatsoever between the reproduction and the thing. There is absolutely, and that's why it's good to sit here, there is absolutely a difference between the reproductions of these paintings and a real Richter. And there's absolutely a difference between Dorothea's work reproduced and the actual thing. So we are living in a time when almost all of the things that would have been basic for her, that were basic for me, things that one could safely assume were true, have been called into question, but not actually fundamentally dislodged. We have to find our way through the verbiage, back through the verbiage, and get back to some kind of primacy of direct experience, knowing that it is always relative, the differences between individual experiences are huge, that it is culturally relative, the differences between cultures and people are huge. Nonetheless, physical things are physical, and optical things are produced by physical things. Now, that's my sermon. And it's a Sunday, or it's a Saturday, actually. I got it. It's the Sabbath. Okay, now, another source, as I said, was Albers. Another source was Mack Stain, and this is somebody that Dorthea, I think, does acknowledge. He was the professor of mathematics at Black Mountain College. He died in the early 50s. She didn't study with Albers because she came after he had stepped down. The other one was Mack Stain's, and Mack Stain's preoccupations were group theory and topology. And it's worth looking him up because he was a profoundly brilliant man. And he set out terms that are still in use in some domains. Now, I think artists mostly don't follow big ideas of any source. They follow the hunches inside of themselves that are prompted by encounters with big ideas. So that if you are told there is a domain that you've never entered before by somebody who's actually been studying it, you reinvent it for yourself out of what you have rather than follow their lead. I don't know any artist, and I don't think Dorthea does it either, but maybe I'm wrong, who sits down and does algebraic equations that are necessary for doing topology, practically speaking, right? Okay, she says she does, fine. My daughter was a topologist, and when she was graduating from college, she wrote for me the equation. It hadn't a single number in it. Okay? Now, she knew where she was, and I didn't, but I knew where she was going by the way she described it. So I would caution people to say that when we're talking about mathematics in regard to her work or anybody's work, we should think of them spatially and experientially rather than theoretically, because as much as theory may help the artist, it probably isn't going to help most viewers. I will tell you flat out now, I was driven away from my mathematics class in 8th grade and told never to come back, that I would get a B if I did not darken my teacher's door, and I have stuck to my deal. So much as I will not reread all of Western thought in order to understand an article in Art Forum, I will not redo all of mathematics to understand Dorthea. But I do know a thing or two about space. And I know it in part from having worked with her, because the kind of space that I'm talking about, which I'll get to, is not anthropocentric, but it is something that one understands by the body in motion and the body in expanse. Now, let me just catch myself here and get a drink. So, let's also pick up some other things. There are shibboleths and myths abroad in this country for about 50 years. Formalism with a capital F, as codified by Clement Greenberg, made a mess of the way people think about things, even in giving a few useful thoughts for us as well. He too gave us some stuff to chew on, but we should also spit it out at a certain point, as was done by John Latham in London. There's a famous piece of his in the Museum of Modern Art where Latham bought a copy of Art and Culture, chewed it up, spit it into bottles, put it in a suitcase, and then it's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. So much for formalism. Now, again, I've read Greenberg extensively, and I've learned from him mostly in opposition. One generally learns from people in opposition, not by subscribing to their ideas. You have to learn it for yourself and out of yourself. And I learned Greenberg by protesting him. I actually got into a fight with him one time. He threatened me with a lawsuit, all because we disagreed about something about painting. I don't know. It's pretty extreme. But anyway, he was a little bit like Donald Trump. You know, but he didn't get his way, he stamped his feet, and when he didn't get his way by bullying you, he threatened to sue you. Anyway, the point is that the ideas of Greenberg were useful up to a point, and then they were nothing but a hobbling of the way in which we see. They included things like the flatness of the picture plane. Now, later on, he tried to dissociate himself from the doctrines that came out of that, as do many crooks. They try to say, oh, no, I didn't say that, no. But anyway, but the point I'm trying to make is this. Dorothea's work is not flat, mostly, and there is no picture, and there is no plane. And that is one of the things that comes out of topology. Topology is surface geometry, not planar geometry. Planar Euclidean geometry does, in fact, explain a great deal of Western art. It explains the construction of perspective, with the precedents for that in Renaissance, and it explains the destruction of perspective, Picasso, Cubism, and so on. But in Dorothea's case, and in the case of others like Elizabeth Murray, you have the folding of space, which is something entirely different mathematically and perceptually. So when you start talking about the folding of space as a way of constructing a world that we can experience with the whole of our sensory apparatus, we are outside the realm of Greenbergian aesthetics altogether. We have actually, and Dorthea is very much a case of this, somebody who does not respect the boundaries either. Because in Greenberg's world, it was all about rectangles. And rectangles are bounded. And one of the things that folding does, and it does very vividly in the White Room, but it does throughout the exhibition, folding accents or annexes spaces beyond the confines of the edge of the thing being folded. So if she starts with a flat piece of paper, which she does sometimes, the edges of the paper are not fixed because she will fold it and they will creep in and pull in and do that. If it's paper on a roll, it will unroll into the room and therefore violate the distinction, the corner between the floor and the wall. All the things she does change up the way in which we experience space and the way in which we experience it optically, that is, we see it, but also the way in which we relate to it physically, because if that's happening in front of our eyes, our access to it with our bodies is in certain ways bracketed or reframed in crucial ways. And the radicality of this work has to do with that. Now, Neighborhood, which is the drawing that I did, involved taking a folded piece of paper and then flipping it and then unfolding it and flipping it again and marking all the points at which you found corners or edges of the paper, and then working with those markings to build a drawing beyond it. Now, it's been a long time since I did this, so I may have gotten the steps mixed up, but it's essentially that. Now, I'll tell you something else. In order to do this, it's a quite large drawing. I would say altogether it's about the size of half of that surface, if it was cut horizontally. And in this, I had to make very long lines. And they had to be very long, very steady, very even, very consistent lines, because if the lines wobble, or if they stop and start, or if they thicken and thin, the space of the drawing goes haywire. So you need to be able to do this in a way that you don't think of it as being a line in pencil or magic marker or red pencil or whatever. You think of it as being almost a physical object in space on the wall. And the tautness of it is all. Now, I learned a very interesting gesture. I didn't bring my cane for this purpose, but I will just use it since I'm a teacher. You grab what you can. You have a yardstick like so, and you have a wall line. You set it up with a level, and you put your thing up then, and you draw like this along the edge of your thing. But then you have all that stuff over here. So you now have to create a motion that allows you to do this all the way over to here, without having it change in weight or speed or thickness or affect in any way. Now, sidebar. My wife, as some of you know, is a musician. And she plays Baroque music mostly. She plays some contemporary music composed for Baroque instruments. And she plays a bowed-stringed instrument that went out of print in about 1800. Bach was the last major modern composer for it. And it wasn't until, I think, Cherepnin in the 20s that anybody composed for it thereafter. And the dynamics of a bowstringed instrument is that in order to have a sustained tone and a sustained dynamics of that tone, that is to say loudness of the tone, you have to exert the same pressure as you're drawing the bow across the strings. Now, if that's the case, the whole dynamics of your arm have to be calibrated such that you can, if the middle point is here and you're pressing down with this, you have to be able to have this where it's easy, the weight of your arm makes it easy to press too hard, and when you're out here, you have to be able to do it so that every muscle from your shoulder to your elbow to your wrist to your fingertips compensates for the loss of natural weight and the deliberate pressure that you apply. So that you have to do this, and then come back again and do this, and then come back again and do this. Now, that creates an absolutely level tone. And Dorothea's drawings are like that. In order to make them, you have to be able to keep a level tone of line. And when I'm teaching drawing, which I do a lot, I teach this to my students first thing. Because many of them make the mistake of thinking that drawing is all about the natural way to draw. There's no such thing as a natural way to draw. Drawing is an inherently unnatural activity. Oh, I was wandering from my mic. Drawing is an inherently unnatural activity. Apes don't type novels, but they also don't draw. So therefore we know that once people start drawing, they're not apes anymore. More particularly, they don't try to do the sort of exercises we're talking about, which are about repetition and calibration rather than simple mark making or simple mimesis, right? So you can make a hand on the wall, that's drawing of a kind, right, in a cave. But when we're talking about this kind of drawing, it is an extremely exquisite, refined, convention-driven activity. And it should be viewed as such. It should not be explained away as being unnatural because it is not like making a hand mark or it is not making a bold gesture. Now, as to that has to do with the folklore of American painting of the 1950s. The idea that the abrupt, fast gestures of abstract expressionism were fast is a myth. And there's a wonderful film that shows Willem de Kooning with a stripper brush, which is a brush you use for painting letters on bank presidents' doors. And a small amount of pressure widens it, and the release of pressure pulls it up. And he used this to great effect. He learned it from Marshall Gorky to create those wonderfully fast lines that slice through his paintings. But there's a film of him drawing one of these things, and he is as slow and patient as a commercial artist writing letters on a bank president's office. He did not do this, right? And even Pollock in his drip paintings did not do that. Pollock dripped, he let it go, but it is not the abrupt, emotionally charged line that we have interpreted it to be. And that doesn't mean the interpretation is wrong. It just means you should not work backwards from facture to emotional impact. Now, I would say that Dorothea's lines are the antithesis of de Kooning, but they're made with the same slow patience. And they're made for some of the same reasons, and they please in some of the same ways. They are very beautiful. And we go to them because they are calming and beautiful and give us something we would not have otherwise. And the measure of how we wouldn't have it otherwise is precisely because it is so willed, so programmatic, so artificial, and so unrelenting. Musicians rehearse, and I rehearsed in her studio in order to perform. Had I not done so, I would not have been able to make the drawing, and as it was, I certainly would not have been able to recoup my drawing after I fucked up the first measurements. Anyway, now, moving on. Dorothea's work, as I said, defies most of the givens of American mid-century formalism, as codified by Greenberg and Michael Fried and others. It, in some ways, though, does fulfill Michael Fried's prescriptions. Michael Fried's famous article, Art and Objecthood, tells you all the reasons why the new art was bad, the new art being largely minimalism. Now, minimalism is a non-movement. None of the artists who belong to it, so-called, or who are aligned with it, belong to it. None of them like the term, and they were quite right in not liking the term, but still it's the term that we now have. Impressionism was the same, Cubism was the same. Many of the greatest movements of modern art were named by people who hated them. And so the artists just had to suffer that for the time. But it's easy for other people who are not artists and who don't know that history to think that the name actually does have some profound sense in terms of what the movement was. In another context, in several other contexts, I've written about Bob Ryman, and I've written precisely that he is not a minimalist, because there is nothing forced or reductive about his work. It is not the least that one could do, but it is enough. Sufficiency is all in the world that we're talking about. And Dorothea's work is largely sufficient without having any extra fat and without trying to do anything it does not do. And that, I think, is really important, because we are always wanting more. It's like the character in Key Largo, the G. Robinson character. And Humphrey Bogart says to him, "Okay, come on, Rocket, what do you want?" He says, "I don't know. I know what you want. You want more." He says, "Yeah, you're right. I want more." Well, right now, everybody seems to want more. And learning to be deeply satisfied and fulfilled by sufficiency would be a nice change of pace, frankly. I think the return of this kind of work will have to do with the return of the understanding of what sufficiency really can mean and how fulfilling it can be. And I think a lot of the polemics around minimalism, historical and ideological and others, should just fall away for a time being, so that we can begin to recover that sense that we are in a room in front of a thing that need be no other way than it is, and need be no other place than it is. And that will be the start. And after that, the artists can kind of relax and let their work do the work for them. Now, as I said, there are a variety of factors in Dorothea's work that bear sort of stipulating. Line width, alignment of lines, line flow. Those are ones I've sort of touched on already. Folds I've also touched on, and that is a key element in a lot of the pieces in the other rooms, but not all of them. She has made some, if you will, paintings. And when I was working with her, she was beginning to do that. Multicolored things, but they also involved folds. They also involved mathematical constructs, which were more important to her in creating them than they are to me in looking at them. And I just simply reserve the privileges of the viewer to choose their own terms, since that is, in fact, what's going to happen anyway. But I think also sometimes one does not get ahead by complicating or creating barriers to the simple, direct experience of the work. That experience is systematically exquisite. Dorothea works at tolerances that are so fine that one of the things you take away from them is that they're that fine. You don't see much that's like that in the world these days, and therefore when you do, it stands out and it is memorable and it is valuable for just that reason. Now, for example, if you look at one of the white pieces in the other room, which is folded, you will notice that there is a red line which disappears under one of the white folded pieces and then reappears elsewhere. It's a red, ordinary colored pencil line. There is also a blue line which is right along the crack of the folded thing, and there you have red, blue, and white in a piece where most people would walk into the room and say, "Oh, some white folded things, some white origami," or some disparaging things that people do say. But when they say them, it's because they're struggling to see them. And what we have to do is to get them past the struggle to the point where they can just say, it is folded, it has red, it has blue, some of it's on the wall, some of it's affixed to the wall, some of it pushes off actively from the wall. The plane of the wall is part of the piece, as is true of virtually all of Ryman's work. If you think of the room as being a part of the piece, the site specificity of a lot of minimal art, so-called, is not that it has to be in this room, but that it has to be on a certain type of wall. And this place was built for that, and many others were built for that as well. And if you consider that the person who did the painting of these walls had to consider very carefully the color white, how many coats, how many lumps and bumps, whether they used a roller or a brush, all of those kinds of things, that contributes to the work. Now, the artist who has made this thing also controls those things, because one work will thrive in one environment, another in another, and they will not necessarily be interchangeable. This installation took Dorthea and the staff here an awful long time, but I'm willing to bet dimes to donuts that that was a big part of it. Okay. I need to speed this up. Now, having said that I made this, and having done this gesture, basically what I'm talking about is a Vitruvian version of space. Now that is mathematical. The famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci of the man inside the circle in the square is of enormous relevance to Mangold, to any number of artists, and it's of relevance to Dorthea. But it's of relevance to Dorthea partly because she skews it. And you see that in the big installation too. The anthropocentric version of that drawing is that everything is centered here, and that symmetry is the balance of the two sides, or at least the equivalence of the two sides. But you'll see over and over and over, and this is true in Mangold's work as well as in Dorthea's, that things are skewed. They are not symmetrical. They are explicitly asymmetrical. And she creates constructs where the machine, so to speak, of the drawing, to use Solowit's language, art, an idea is a machine for making art. The machine that she creates is necessarily going to create something that's asymmetrical because the basic unit is not. If you take a piece of paper that is longer than it is wide, and if you fold it in certain ways, it will then begin to multiply the number of inconsistencies of symmetry, and that creates excitement. Now, why do we see it? We see it because we expect symmetry and we don't get it. We see it because we're built. Most of us are kind of lopsided in certain ways. I won't go into the anatomical details. But in terms of our axis, we still have this cruciform axis in our mind's eye. We have a template that we project into things in front of us. And what she does and what Mangold and others have done is to exploit that, to throw us off balance. So we're always trying to compensate for the degree to which we're a little bit off balance, that our eyes see like this, but our bodies have the kind of kinetic response to what we see that makes that balance crucial. So that when we're experiencing a work of Dorothea's, we are not just seeing something, and we're not seeing an idea illustrated either. What we are doing is we are engaging physically fully as much as we would be as if we were walking into a space mined with little black boxes, as Michael Fried once invented. Michael Fried was very worried about tripping. And he wrote at length in Art and Objecthood about the dangers of the art that was made according to minimalist percepts, because it was laying an ambush for us. Yes, it was. And it was not with malice, but it was a mindful thing to say, pay attention to you. What's in front of you, pay attention. But Dorothea's work does that just as much. When you think you know where you are, all of a sudden you realize that the axis is off. That things are diagonal where you think they're going to be vertical. That they're spread apart by a large amount of space, and you have to intuit the point where lines meet, but you don't actually see it. Or maybe you see the point itself because it's written in red, but you don't see those lines actually come together. It's only the target for the lines that are approaching that, and so on. So the whole dynamic of the art becomes literally dynamic. Your body registers this as a series of cues as to how to move and how to look, and where to go next and where to go beyond that. Let me see what I've got. I'm pretty well caught up to where I thought I'd be, but I got there by a route I didn't expect. Okay. Since it's now almost 3 o'clock, is that correct? Okay, good. What? 20, oh, I got a little more time. Okay, now, what I would recommend is that leaving here, after your libations or whatever, you go back into the galleries to experience the work in that way, or that you, come back here often to experience it that way. I don't get here nearly as often as I would like, but there is always plenty of stuff to see, so I'm going to do a little plug for Dia and say that this is one of the rare places where it's possible. I used to work for a large factory in Midtown Manhattan, and we had to take down things constantly, which is fine. I was always explaining to collectors as well as to artists that, we're a museum. We're kind of like a reading room of a great public library. Things come and things go. They stay there, if you don't deaccession them. They stay there, but they don't live there in permanence. There are a relatively small number of places where things live in permanence. In this country, the Houston Menil Foundation, connected to the same family, is one. This is another, and there are a few others out there. But it's really important that we have the ability to come back and re-experience something in time and over time. And we come back different every time we do it, and therefore this should not be a one-stop trip to see Dorothea's show. It should be a first or second or third stop trip to see Dorothea's show, and since it's a long-running occasion, you should come back as often as you can, and I will as often as I can. I will say that this is a moment for Dorthea. She recently had an exhibition at MoMA. She's out and about in the world more so than she was for a while. and she is now here in depth. It is an historical slice of her work, and there's much, much more beyond that. Somebody with an adventurous turn of mind should think about what the show that is not here out of her collected is, and make that show, or maybe put this together with something else and make the big museum show that is her due. She is the only member of her generation and person in her neighborhood, so to speak, of aesthetics, who has not had such a show. And the other one who's not had it recently and should have it is Bob Mangold. There are many people who don't know this work. I'm constantly reminded by my students that there are people who just don't know things because they missed the 2 or 3 seasons when those people were in view. Incredibly, I was talking the other day with some students at Yale about Jasper Johns, perhaps the most exposed, arguably overexposed artist of his generation. And I'm not saying that maliciously, but I do think there's a downside to being seen too often. And, you know, they said, who? Now, that may mean that the pool for Yale is not as good as it used to be. It may mean that he doesn't have as many hits on little devices in their hands, or it may simply be that we forget that the things that are acquired by us and held dear by us and re-experienced by us are new news to other people. And with it, I hope it is delivered in a new way, because I don't think we want to recreate the discourses of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. They don't work, most of them. I think we need to find new, plainer language to talk about a phenomenon which cannot be explained and barely be described, but which can be directly had. Museums exist for people to have first-hand experience of what Walter Benjamin called aura. And this is a place where aura is everywhere. And I would recommend that you come back here, that you go into the Dorthea show, and that you consider that you're kind of in the aura factory, and that you experience what she does for your own reasons, that you learn about why she does it, but that at the same time you think about all the sympathies and correspondences that reverberate through these buildings, through this building, with other artists with whom she's in harmony, or if not in harmony, then with interesting dissonance. And I'm getting little singles from Courtney. There's a prompter's box which says, this is what you're supposed to say, and there's a prompter's box that says, you're not supposed to say anymore. So.
Rob, I want to thank you for that. It's been really wonderful to actually listen to you talk about Dorthea. I feel like I can ask you a million questions, and I have access to both of you, but so many of us here, this is our one shot. Does anyone have a question for Rob?
Well, I just love the idea of an aura. I loved the idea of an aura factory. That's not a question.
You want to be the foreman? Don't be shy. Or do be shy, but, you know.
Hi, Rob.
Hi.
You talked a lot about the relationship of the viewer's body to the work. I wonder, given that we've seen a lot of dance, the dancers from the early 60s at MoMA and elsewhere in recent months, whether you have any thoughts about the relationship of Dorthea's work to the world of dance.
Well, it's well known, and I think she's still on the walls at MoMA. The Judson Dance Theater workshop, she was associated with that, and she performed in Meet Joy, which is yes, thank you. Yeah, Carolee Schneeman's piece, and you can see her if you want to see Dorthea young and, you know, pretty hot. Look at Meet Joy; she's enjoying it. But anyway, there's that too. But there's something else to mention too, which I had in here, but I forgot to say, which is, insofar as one thinks of the Vitruvian proportion and the Vitruvian template, There's an important thing that Dorthea does. Not only does she violate symmetry, but she violates high and low. The Vitruvian diagram does not talk about what's under your feet or in front of you, sort of just in the first few steps. And numbers of her pieces go way higher off the wall than would be in that comfortable zone. Now, you know, in the old days at MoMA, Mark is here, who is an art handler there. In the old days at MoMA, everything was supposed to be hung in 57 center, right? That was the rule. And when I got there, I said, what? And I didn't. But anyway, that was the rule. And we have been trained Pavlovian, Mark Williams, I say, in a Pavlovian way to think of certain heights as natural viewing heights. And Dorthea stretches that, really stretches it in some cases, moderately stretches in others, but there are many instances where you're kind of almost ready to rise up off your heels to see what she puts on the wall. So in that sense, your body is responding in a kind of Pavlovian way to a lure that is beyond its normal position. And that is, I think, a choreographic effect, if you will.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can I ask a question of Dorthea? Will she take it? Dorthea, will you answer a question? Okay, you haven't seen this work in a very, very long time. What was the biggest surprise for you?
Dorthea, don't answer just yet.
I don't think there were any surprises really, except how damn hard it was to do it, because none of the materials that were originally used to work with exist anymore. And again, I have to say thank you to Heidi, who was some kind of genius, because she found materials that couldn't be found and so on. But that was the only surprises. I didn't really expect it to be so difficult to do. It was more difficult to do now than it was the first time around. The first time around, domain of the variable, well, we developed it over a year, but then we knew how to do it. And we worked 3 years, 3 days a week on this. That's a lot of time.
I can't think of a better way to end today. I hope that you have a few more minutes or more than an hour to go and immerse yourself in Dorthea Rockburne. I hope that Rob's words really stick with you, because I think they gave us a little bit of glue to take with us back out there. Thank you, Rob, for your insightful talk. And thank you, Dorthea, for everything.